All right, hey, how we doing out there, guys? So welcome back to another episode of the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. So it is currently Sunday evening, July the, was it 10th? Yeah, 10th. At about 18:11. Now, I don't normally ask for things and I find it annoying, but YouTube has me on a complete and total shadow ban as far as things go. So, if you guys like my videos or like my podcast stuff, I ask that you hit like, hit subscribe, or recommend it to other people. If you dislike it, hit dislike. Write in the comments all the things you think that I do wrong. No problems with that whatsoever. Just see if I can try to get over the hump. Ever since I told YouTube that I did not want to have a Google Pay account for ad-related things, all of a sudden it turns out that my videos don't go very far on very many things. So enough chitter chatter about that. So let's talk about the Russian operations in Ukraine as of today. So again, like I said, I don't like to do a lot of the, just like every single day update. There's some good people out there that do stuff like that, and some of their channels I follow. One that I like to check in fairly often, I like Denis Davidov's stuff. He's a Ukrainian guy. That kind of gives a lot of good updates. One, he knows how to pronounce the names of all the cities, so like that gives him a leg up on everyone else who's doing stuff like that. But I kind of assume that somebody who's from Ukraine and still lives in Ukraine has access to a little bit of, kind of some personal, or not some firsthand, but some, first and secondhand information from people. So I find that interesting. And then just going and checking a lot of the military-related channels. They have a lot of fire-related data and stuff, which is kind of one of the ways that they're, that they sort of track, activity, especially like, artillery and other such ordnance-related stuff. So, since the last time that I did an episode talking about operations in Ukraine, there's been a fair amount of stuff that's kind of changed. So I have like 9 maps pulled up here, so we'll see how good I do at picking them out, by the ones I need. So we'll flash back to an older map talking about the operations in Donbass specifically. And so I just sort of flashed back, like 20 days, like 10 or 20 days, so I could find when the the pocket, what we'd call the cauldron, the salient, was kind of at its most exposed, and then we can kind of compare it to operations now, and why the Ukrainians and the Russians have made some of the choices that they've made, or at least why we think that they've made that, and kind of talk a little bit about some of that stuff. So kind of at its peak, so obviously the Ukrainians were still active in and fighting for Severodonetsk here and Lysychansk, which is on the other side of the river right here, and so we can kind of see the extent of how deep this sort of potential cauldron, this salient, goes into the line. So a couple things I wanted to talk about with this. I've done videos, going way back to like when I first started a YouTube channel. I did something kind of talking about salients, and I've talked about this like many times before. So a salient is obviously a protrusion into an enemy's line, and so it seems straightforward, kind of on the surface, like, hey, what, like having a salient is bad because an enemy can attack you on 3 sides. But as I've talked about before, salients provide a lot of potential opportunities, and both positively and negatively, for both sides engaged in a conflict. And so a couple of those that we could kind of talk about that I've already mentioned before is, so like I said, if you are the element, so if you're Ukraine in this instant and you have the salient pointing into the Russian lines, one advantage that gives you, and so it extends the front line that an enemy has to cover. So if you imagine, so you take this distance here from up and around Izium, and then just down to, I can't even see what's down there because my screen's kind of purple, but down towards, in the Donetsk area there, coming across this MO3 highway, down towards, Vershina, and, man, that almost sounds like I said Virginia. Let's just call it Vershina. So we look at like what that would be in a linear distance. Now look at what it actually represents in actual distance. It's humongous. So that extends the line, which means an enemy has to have more elements. They have to have more units in the line to hold the line. It also means that if you're Ukraine and you occupy these defensive areas, it means that you can technically respond to any of the sides affected and have a shorter distance to go. And that's what we call having interior lines, i.e., because an enemy is on the outside and they are kind of arced around you, you have a shorter distance. So again, I'm kind of making this up, but imagine you're Ukraine and you have artillery units somewhere in this area here. Theoretically or realistically, they could be used to attack targets near Lyman or Izium, to attack things down closer to Bakhmut and things like that, over towards Severodonetsk. Whereas if you're the Russians, and you have to have your artillery back from the lines over here, yes, it can assist in certain areas, but it can't be an assist, say, all the way down here over towards whatever that word was we just tried to say and butchered it a second ago. What it also means is that it's easier for a smaller amount of Ukrainians, for example, to defend the area if the Russians are unable to coordinate attacks on multiple sides simultaneously or concurrently. And what it means is that if you're the Russians, or any country in this kind of conceptual example, is what you want to do is you want to be able to attack on the north, you want to be able to attack on the south, you want to be able to attack on the east, and press the line from all sides. That way an enemy is forced to defend all of those. And then conversely, if you're defending, a classical tactic is what's called defeat in detail. And defeat in detail, what that means is that basically we want to use our assets, our units, and we want to attack pieces of the enemy with individual overwhelming odds. So if we can get multiple battalions to attack a single battalion and destroy it, then pull those battalions back, attack a different battalion. So there's opportunities for both when it comes to that. If you're the Russians and you're only able to attack, in kind of one position at a time, then the Ukrainians are able to go, okay, hey, we pull some units from the north here, bolster in the south. Hey, they're attacking from the north again, nothing's going on in the south. Okay, cool, grab some units from the south, pop them up to the north. And you can kind of do that shifting around, and give an enemy a lot of problems just because you have the interior lines on that. Now, kind of the other thing about it is that having a salient that protrudes into a line that also occupies some sort of major transit hub, convergence of road and rails, airfields, things like that. In this particular case, a river on the Seversky Donetsk River that the Russians need to cross, is what it also means is that now they're in an even worse place than they just appear, from like a mathematical or, from like a physical standpoint. Because now, not only do they have this protrusion into their line that makes their line much, much larger, but now it occupies a significantly important operational or strategic objective, which now we either have to go around and try to do something else with, or we have to try to take this head on, which is going to incur a lot of casualties and use a lot of, our force and our, potential ability to project force. So now, a couple of other things, and we don't exactly know to what extent this happened or to what extent, if it did happen, it was intentional, but it does appear that the Russians did leave the cauldron open longer than necessary, or maybe potentially a better way of saying that is they did not commit to a massive penetration and breakthrough to try to seal the cauldron, to seal the pocket there, because they wanted to encourage the Ukrainians to bring, particularly their new equipment from the Western, countries, particularly artillery and things like that, into this pocket or this potential pocket. That way it could be more easily found and dealt with air assets, artillery assets, things like that, which, does make perfect sense. If you're the Ukrainians, the thing you have to be careful of is every time you get a brand new M777, howitzer from the Americans, or a Caesar 155 self-propelled gun from the French or whatever, just being like, all right, cool, go send it out to the east, put it in the middle there where it's obvious, and then gets, kind of destroyed or gets in some way damaged and then has to go back, for significant repairs after that. So we do know that happened, whether intentionally or not, to some extent. We don't know, how much of it happened. It's just hard to find, really legitimate information, in terms of numbers on that. But another thing that, kind of comes to mind with that is that if you're the Russians, leaving the pocket open also makes a lot of sense because, one, they have what we assume is a 10 to 15 to 1 advantage in guns, i.e. artillery, and something like a 40 to 1 advantage in actual ammunition for artillery, which is why they've just been kind of doing their steamroller tactics I talked about in the last video, a la August von Mackensen, and Golitsa Tarnow, offensive in 1915, which makes a lot of sense. If you have a huge advantage in artillery and things like that, that's a perfectly, legitimate tactic, provided you're also not worried about like just absolutely destroying all the terrain that you're operating in. And then it makes sense to try to draw in Ukrainian equipment, but also Ukrainian units. And this is something that I don't think gets enough attention in people's brains. And in some ways, it's very hard to conceptualize. And I've tried to make videos on this before, which is that attriting or otherwise damaging, causing casualties, killing trained enemy troops is a humongous drain on their ability to project force, their ability to fight. And what I kind of talked about, and this has been years ago, I made a video kind of talking about the strategic implications of some of that stuff, is that just having a body with a rifle doesn't count for very much. There's an awful lot that goes into being an individual infantryman, but also being an individual infantryman within a unit of infantrymen, and being able to operate correctly, just as far as how you do your basic patrolling ops and offensive, defensive ops and stuff like that, and everything. So attriting an experienced enemy, an enemy units or enemy force is absolutely a good tactic to do. Now, we know the Ukrainians are training a lot more, and technically speaking, their military is very large in absolute numbers, but again, that doesn't tell the whole tale. So like I talked about in the video I made on the kind of the strategic aspects of that like years back, was that, so we use America, for example. So I was in the Marine Corps. And so in the Marine Corps, you go to 13 weeks of what we call recruit training, so boot camp. Then if you're an infantryman like myself, then you go to like 8 or 9 weeks of infantry school. I think it's 8 weeks of training, but most people were there for 9 weeks because you kind of get screwed over for a week. And then you go to your unit after that. So if you look at that, so you have basically 3 months where you're in boot camp, 2 months where you're at infantry school. So 5 months, there's usually a 10-day break in between where you go on what we call boot leave, when you get to go home after boot camp for a week and a half. But that's 6 months, which is that's a fairly long amount of time. I mean, obviously that's, longer than this entire conflict has been going on. So technically speaking, if you were America and you put a guy in boot camp on the day Russia invaded Ukraine, you would not yet have an infantryman who graduated, from infantry school yet. And then when you graduate from infantry school, you are an absolute basic, worthless grunt. Everything was in, kind of a lowest common denominator. Everyone's an idiot sort of training. You go to your unit, and that's where you kind of get like your more, continual training. And and you're also working with like the people that you're going to be doing this with. Because obviously when you're in infantry school, then typically what happens is there's certain units that are, kind of next on the slot for deployment. So they kind of split you guys up and bump you out to 2, 3, 4 different battalions. And so you'll be with a few, you'll be with, several of the guys that you went to infantry school with, but they will not comprise the majority of the people you're with, obviously, at your new unit. And so that's something to keep in mind, which is that, attriting not only trained but experienced members is a very big deal. And historically, it's got a lot of precedent. And, as I'm talking about it, like one example that like comes into my mind that's had huge historical implications is we talk about the Battle of the Somme in summer of 1916. So the Brits, and the French launch a humongous attack against the Germans, partially to relieve pressure on Verdun, and then in coordination with the Russians, who launched a large offensive against the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans in the Brusilov offensive. And so the British had spent all of 1915 basically trying to build up and go from a small professional contract-related military to a large conscript army with what they called Kitchener's Army and a lot of what they called PALS battalions. So people would enlist, and they had regional like units. So you would be based in a unit that was, everyone was from the area that you were. And so you could join these PALS battalions where basically you sign up to serve with like all the people from your hometown and your friends and stuff like that. So they start filtering into the line, kind of by the start of 1916. Then, 1st of July is, when the Battle of the Somme kicks off. And basically, it's just an absolute bloodbath. And the British just get completely slaughtered. So the British take something like 480,000 casualties over the course of the Somme. The French take something like 200 to 250,000. And the Germans, they think, take between 500,000 and like 600,000 casualties. But what they kind of talk about is like, in the end, because the lines didn't move more than like 9 miles in the whole thing, but in the end, kind of what happened was you basically traded completely fresh, basically worthless British soldiers in the brand new Kitchener's Army for basically the last remainders of the pre-war, very well-trained and experienced Kaiser's army, the imperial army of the German Empire at the time. So trading untrained bodies for trained and experienced bodies, in that case, especially in a war of attrition, made a lot of sense. So kind of, that kind of rounds out, the main talking points, talking about, sort of salient related stuff. So now we'll kind of pop to the situation as it actually sits now. Again, I have a whole bunch of maps pulled up. So got the first one. So now we know the Russians took Severodonetsk. The Ukrainians pulled out of Lysychansk a few days later. We don't know how good of order that the Ukrainians pulled out in. It appears that they must have pulled out in relatively, concise order. Otherwise, the Russians would be pumping out massive amounts of propaganda about the huge haul of equipment and prisoners and things like that. Now, it has to be said that I have a theory that one of the reasons why it's hard to get good information is that all of the videos that come out of like the successful attacks, and if you guys are like myself and you follow it religiously, all the drone attacks and the anti-tank guided missiles and all that sort of stuff, is that the Ukrainians have done, and what I personally assess is the only thing the Ukrainians are winning is the war of public opinion, or worldwide public opinion. So the Ukrainians have controlled it and done a good enough job that when they put out videos of them destroying Russian equipment or killing Russian soldiers or whatever, then it's seen as a positive thing and people support them. Whereas the Russians, when they put it out, it kind of draws condemnation and it sort of hardens people against them. So they're not able to put out a lot of videos, showing what they have or haven't done, again, and we just kind of don't know. So that's kind of my theory on that. So we know the Russians, controlled that, and so they managed to seal off a small amount of this, but again, it looks like the Ukrainians did manage to pull out in relatively okay order. So now they're kind of in what they call an operational pause, but there's still a lot of artillery fire and things going on, and so the Russians kind of need to refit, reorganize. They've taken a lot of casualties. They've had a lot of their, vehicles and stuff like that. Nearest I can figure, based on, again, this is based on the Russians' own numbers, so you take that with a grain of salt. At the start of the war, it looks like they've lost pretty much exactly 10% of all of their vehicles that they possessed in the entire military. Tanks, armored vehicles, MLRSs, aircraft, trucks and everything. So about 10%, which for a country like them where they do not possess very much of a capacity currently to replace them, that's definitely a very big deal. And then obviously I think they put on a really big show for the world, in the last few decades of, having 10,000 or 20,000 tanks in storage or whatever. It turns out that most of those are just, going to be used for parts and scrap. They're old T-62, so they're not nearly as formidable in, most armored roles as the T-80s and T-90s and things like that. But so now, we kind of also, we know that that gave them total control, like capturing Lysychansk, gave them total control of the Luhansk Oblast. And so what we kind of presume is that they're going to be moving on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk here by way of Siversk and a couple others. I'll flash over to my legit map here. So here's Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Severodonetsk, which was captured here. So the Russians their lines basically come up to about, right here. So a couple things that we need to keep in mind why these particular places are as important as they are. Like I say in all of my videos, like it's basically not a surprise why people fight in the places that they do. And it's pretty much always because of, roads, railways, or river crossings, other types of things that dictate that. So one, why do the Russians want to capture Sloviansk and Kramatorsk? Well, so you can see right here, the Russians are in Izium. They're down south pushing towards Bakhmut, right? So you need to connect those in a way that you can move between them from a north-south axis. So the roads that do that run through Izium, they run through Sloviansk, and then, kind of by way of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, that's how you connect these two kind of, sort of outside pincers over here. These two, your north and south, is through the roads that run through here. So a road that runs right through here, and then this main MO3 highway that runs, kind of a little bit east of Bakhmut and through the outskirts of Sloviansk here. So taking that is hugely important because, like we said, is the whole time that this salient has been protruding in the lines is the Russians cannot directly connect say operations down here with operations up, in Izium, like proper. So they have to go around. So obviously as they start to squeeze this pocket down, that gets shorter and better for the Russians and worse for the Ukrainians, but they still don't control the major roadways here. And as we can kind of see, so I've got the terrain map pulled up here. So you can see this is like a marshy, like kind of swampish area that, you know, coincides with the Seversky Donetsk River and all that. So it's one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have also been able to hold on to that fairly well, is that the terrain just sucks as far as the Russians being able to use a whole bunch of points of ingress or attack, and they kind of have to narrow themselves down, and that's been aiding the Ukrainians, defensively. So as they're kind of pushing here, so obviously they haven't fully taken Bakhmut yet either. It looks like they're pushing towards Seversk here. So, pushing towards Seversk, which will, one, give them access to, this highway. Let's see which one that is. Pop up for me. Maybe. It doesn't want us to know what highway that is. Whatever. Anyways, this is the main MO3 highway here. So pushing towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk will be huge for that. Once that happens, basically the entirety of this, if they're able to get Sloviansk and or Kramatorsk, that will kind of be the death knell of all the operations in here, because they'll have major access to this highway here, which will give them, kind of access to their ground lines of communication and connect with all this that comes out and around Kharkov. And so we expect to see that they're going to keep pushing, towards Sloviansk, kind of in coming days. And, so we'll kind of be tracking that. So now we'll kind of flash up to Kharkov a little bit here. So Kharkov, everything's more or less the same. So like I've talked about before, the important thing that that's going on up around here, the reason why the Russians have been attacking towards Kharkov, even though they pulled out of, because they were like occupying the suburbs and were kind of actually inside of, this sort of ring road, what you would call that, of this MO3 highway, is they need to protect. So their ground lines of communication basically run down through here. So this is a town called Vovshansk here, and I can flash back to it on my other map in a second. So the ground lines of communication, i.e. the roads and the ways that they get stuff down to, say, Izium and then down to the Donbass, runs through that area. So the Russians are trying to push back on this because they need to keep the Ukrainians out of artillery range of these kind of main. So you can see where it's dotted on this particular map of these main ground lines of communication. Conversely, the Ukrainians keep trying to push back a little bit because, one, they're getting Western artillery, which has improved range over Russian stuff, also over the Russian/Ukrainian stuff that they currently have, but also trying to get in range for things like the HIMARS. So you guys have probably been seeing stuff. So the HIMARS is it's a MLRS, a multiple launch rocket system. It's American. It has exceedingly long range and exceedingly high accuracy and multiple different types of warheads that it can fire. And so I believe they have 4 in country now, and America's promised them something like a dozen. Maybe we promised them 30. I can't remember. Anyways, last they updated, they had 4 of them in country. And the Ukrainians have kind of been going ham with them. So they've hit something like 27 ammo depots in the last few days with them. Like I said, so the current ammunition that we've given them with that has a range of about 80 kilometers, which is substantially more than artillery. And so, so you're getting close to 60-mile range, when it comes to that. And so that's allowing them to, while not able to, kind of stand up gun for gun with, Russian artillery, but attacking their ammunition depots and stuff will absolutely aid them in the short term. And then kind of depending on what the Russians have, as far as in stores, but also their ability to pick back up their manufacture of that will kind of tell the tale. So again, operations around here stay, mostly the same. But if you are the Ukrainians, there is a huge, a huge need for you to, one, keep the Russians away from, Kharkov, because it's a major, hub for you as well. But also, if you are able to push them back and get yourself into positions where you can threaten these ground lines of communication, that's huge. And I'll flash out here to my good Google Maps so we can kind of see. Like I said, is like Russian roads are not particularly good. So like as your roads set up, like everything's sort of basically spider webs out from. There we go. Everything spiders out from Moscow, basically. But as you come down, you only have a couple of main north-south axes, right? So you have this one that comes down through Voronezh and goes all the way down onto the to the east of Luhansk down here. You have this one that comes down through Orel and Kursk and Belgorod, which is what they're kind of taking in, and then they're having to take this subhighway, which goes through Voshansk here, like I talked about, and this is where their ground lines of communication come through there. So if you're the Ukrainians and you're able to push back into this area where you can bring this under substantial artillery fire, or even maybe even all the way over here, now they're going to have to move stuff further out into these areas over here, or direct more things further off to the east over there, which just makes their logistical problems, more pronounced when it comes to that. In and of itself, it doesn't win them anything, but so obviously being able to affect them logistically like that, will definitely aid them. So as we kind of stay flashed out here, so this way you get a good kind of assessment of why, Kharkov, but also why Izium, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk are so important, because this is all that MO3 highway. So you connect, damn it. So you connect all this and you keep this sealed off, and now you have very good north-south running ground lines of communication, i.e., ability to transport things, and you're in a much better position logistically if you are the Russians. So let's kind of flash over to my Kherson map here. So another area where there's been a lot of stuff going on. So the Russians are obviously across Kherson. So as I talked about before, so Kherson crosses the lower Dnieper here, and the Russians were as far as Mykolaiv. The Ukrainians pushed them back from there, and been kind of like slowly treating them and attacking them. There's been a lot of fighting to get on the east bank of this, which is called the Inhulets River. There's been a lot of fighting around Davydiv Brid here, because there's a bridge crossing, which I believe got blown up now. But that leads directly on the road that goes to Nova Kakhovka, which is where there's a major dam and a reservoir back here, which obviously the Ukrainians would want to drive to. And the Russians want to keep open, because one, obviously all their units that are on this side of the, what's called the Kremenchuk Reservoir, and all the lower Dnieper here, is basically all the traffic runs through right here and runs through, what's right here, but through Kherson. And so obviously if you're the Ukrainians, you want to try to capture the bridges, one, to trap any Russians on this side that you can, but you want that so you can use that as some sort of springboard to be able to attack into Crimea and the rest of southern Ukraine. Let me flash over here. So again, so this is what we're talking about, is Kherson here. So like I said, your crossings are here in Nova Kakhovka and then here in Kherson. But once you get across like that, that's it. That's your crossings. And then, like I said, now you're pushing back towards Crimea. So if the Ukrainians and you want to eventually take back the Crimea, or if you want to try to also eliminate this, what we call the land bridge, which is this M14 highway that runs through Mariupol and Melitopol and stuff. Be able to assault that, you need the bridges in, Kherson and Nova Kakhovka. Otherwise, the obvious answer would be to just blow them up and try to trap the Russians on that side, which would be a very good tactical victory, but it would be a very poor operational decision, because now you would have no ability to get your own troops onto the other side, and you would give a very good defensive barrier to the Russians up against the Dnieper there. So that's kind of where they're sitting with that. Now, it kind of changes all the time, depending on the maps that I've seen. I've seen maps that indicate the Ukrainians gotten as close as something like 17, kilometers there, which would be, what would that be, like 11 miles, 10, 11 miles, something like that. I'm always doing the math. I know that a 5K is 3.1 miles, so I do all related mile conversions of just using a 5K to convert that in my head. And they've been close enough that they could they could use some artillery work on Kherson. But the other side of things, and this is something I've talked about in my other videos as well, is what makes things difficult, and that you have to keep in mind as you're the Ukrainians and the longer the conflict goes on, is every single artillery shell, every bullet from an AK, every grenade you throw, everything that you do explodes somewhere in Ukraine. And so there has to be some sort of decision on how much collateral damage that you want to cause. One, just because obviously you want to spare your people from it. But then in some of these areas, you're also dealing with the fact that you need to make sure that Ukrainians stay pro-Ukraine. So what you cannot do is in areas, let's say, where there were, people who are a little bit more, kind of malleable in their allegiances, is be very clearly doing things that were just as bad as what the Russians were doing, And then while the Russians occupy a place, a lot of people would probably just be like, you know what? I'm just gonna sit this one out, or hey, I'm gonna aid them because you're currently shelling my block, whereas the Russians are not. And so those are kind of, those are problems that you have when you're defending your own territory, which is that every single, round that you fire blows up somewhere in your stuff. And you're also, not only are you dealing with like the military situation, supplies, logistics, you're dealing with the morale and the public support thing. As it sits right now, Ukrainian public support is very good, but it's not indomitable. And there are obviously areas of the country, obviously the separatist areas, where like there are, not everyone, but there's a significant number of the population are either malleable and can kind of be pushed either way, or who are, pro-Russia. And so you have to be careful with, how you operate doing that. So I think, kind of as we kind of move forward and as Ukraine acquires more, good artillery, good equipment from, the Western countries, and presumably sets up some form of large-scale operational and strategic level of counterattack, it'll be curious to see, what their plan is. And what I talked about before is the other thing that we have to keep in mind, and what is very dangerous for Ukraine, is that the longer that they let the fighting go on in the separatist oblast, so you have the Luhansk Oblast and the Donetsk Oblast here, which are the two separatist areas, and that area represents, I think they say it's like 90% of all of the industry in Ukraine. And obviously, so the Donbass is where like all the coal and pretty much all the manufacturing and stuff is in the country. So, from a strategic standpoint, Russia being in control of that degrades Ukraine every day that they're there, which means that Ukraine is basically, one, their economy is wrecked, and so they're going to be reliant on other people to send them stuff. It also means that if the Russians then kind of, Marshall plan that stuff and build it back up to use it for themselves, that now they start to have access, to the goods or to the, the raw materials and things that come from that. I mean, we already know that they're selling, grain and, that they stole from the Ukrainians. So obviously they're not at all above that. So it's something that you have to be very careful of if you're Ukraine, is that, you're playing this balancing act where you kind of have, you're like a juggler, but you got a whole bunch of balls up in the air. It's like, one, militarily, you have to fight for territory hard enough that your people see you fighting for it and doing a good job, but not so hard that you get stuck and encircled all the time and lose people and lose equipment that way. You need to use all of the assets that you have as violently as you can, but you can't use it so violently that you in some way degrade the morale of your own civilians and, either make them, kind of ambivalent or, turn them to be pro-Russia. And then you have to you have to come out of your defensive positions and counterattack at some point in this conflict. And they have not shown the ability to do that yet. And this is something I mentioned in my last video. And I've had this conversation a lot. Because I think, a lot of people, even my other friends who are like fairly like military like oriented, or, they're very like on board, on Team Ukraine and stuff like that. And it's hard to watch, the team that you want to win, like lose or be losing, have bad things happen to them. But as it sits right now, I have not seen any example of anything that indicates that Ukraine is winning anything or has the ability to, aside from, we kind of talked about the public relations, the public support kind of thing. But as it sits right now, all of their counterattacks have been very localized. There's been no large operational counterattacks, definitely no strategic level counterattacks. They've had something like 2,800 cruise missiles launched at them, and they've only managed to shoot down a couple dozen of them total. So they're kind of still at the mercy of, any long range related, attacks that the Russians want to launch on them. They've had some definite tactical successes and done some things well from a tactical standpoint. And realistically, probably their operations in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk were probably a very good tactical and a relatively good operational stand for them. It doesn't, as far as we know, they definitely didn't lose like all of their brand new equipment there. So that seems like, it attrited the Russians. It made the Russians look very bad. And it's definitely, it's gotten to the point where they're having to really scrounge and scrap for replacements and vehicles and things like that, which is good. They've managed to, kind of embarrass Russia multiple times with attacks on naval assets and attack on air assets and things like that. And then since they got the HIMARS system, they've gone on an absolute rampage of attacking ammunition storage depots, which is very good. That is exactly the kind of thing that you should be attacking if you're them, as well as command and control command and control like elements, which is again absolutely the types of things that you should be doing. If the Ukraine, so it'll be something to to kind of see as we go forward, whether they can launch some sort of large scale counterattack. But another thing that we need to keep in mind is that one of the games that Russia is playing right now is they're calling this a special operation because they're really trying to make it sound like they're recapturing one of their territories. So Ukraine, it kind of goes back to being Russian, quote unquote, back in like 1708 or something like that. Anyways, the early 18th century. And then it was part of the Russian Federation basically all the way up until the fall of the Soviet Union in one capacity or another. I mean, there was times during the Russian Civil War and stuff where it's, not exactly. And parts of it have been kind of like chewed off, in the Russo-Polish War and stuff like that. But Ukraine does not have a long history in the modern sense of being its own country. So Russia is playing that up, as far as like what they're doing, which is why they have not announced a general mobilization. Because one, they're trying to, their public support is on life support basically, and they're trying to keep it that way. It also means that they definitely have not tapped into all of the, air assets and things that they have to be able to assault Ukraine. So for Ukraine, that's a good thing. It also means that they have not put themselves on a wartime footing as far as manufacture of military-related equipment, ammunition, vehicles, things like that. So all the things that they get destroyed or severely damaged, they don't really currently have any way to replace it other than trying to go back through their old stocks. And so one of the positives for that, for Ukraine is that now we see them launching like cruise missile attacks or otherwise, air to surface, surface to surface missile attacks with like either older weapons that are very imprecise or like they've been using kind of like anti-ship missiles to do like famously the attack there on the Kremenchuk Mall a few days ago, which obviously still have plenty of explosive punch to them, but they're not very precise. And so that indicates to us that they've dangerously attrited the number of these precision weapons that they have. And we know from, video evidence, but also Ukrainians, who kind of gave, after action reports, particularly around Kiev and stuff, is that the Russians were capturing things like tractors and washing machines and stuff like that to take superconductors and chips out of and things like that because their own manufacturing is so incapable and so not set up for that stuff. So all of those are positive for Ukraine. But they're also not instant fixes. So there's kind of, I've had this talk with like my friends before a lot. We always talk about this a lot in relation to like combat sports, is that if you're going to operate a strategy of exhaustion, you have to have two things in place to make it work. One is that you have to affect the ability to replenish the thing, i.e. if we're talking about combat, military-related operations, you could talk about that. That could be like the factories, or it could even be the supply of raw materials to the factories, or it could be the logistical abilities to get that stuff to places, i.e. attacking bridges and roads and railways and things like that. And the second thing that you have to have is you have to have somewhere for them to expend that energy. So just affecting the manufacture or the replenishment doesn't exhaust an enemy if they are not depleting the current supplies. And so as it sits right now, Ukraine is set up in a position where they are definitely depleting the current supplies. It appears that between the sanctions and between Russia's refusal to go on to a formal wartime footing, there is some interruption of the replenishment or the supply, but not total disruption. So if Ukraine going forward, those are definitely things to think about. Things like attacks on refineries, attacks on roads, rails. If we give them longer range missiles for the HIMARS, attacking the Kerch Bridge, stuff like that. So one, treating them on the battlefield, and then affecting the ability to replenish that. Those are the two elements required for any sort of strategy of exhaustion, when it comes to that. But again, we'll see how that goes, because the other side that you have to be, conscious of if you're the Ukraine is, again, and I've said this before, like I am I'm not a person who believes in any real rules when it comes to war, particularly if you're invaded by someone else. But because Russia has not formally declared war and has not formally put themselves on a mobilization status and a wartime footing, if you're the Ukraine and you start committing atrocities against the Russians, which I think could absolutely serve a legitimate logistical role, you may give enough of the Russian population, kind of a jolt in the arm that says, hey, we should do a full-on war kind of thing here, guys. And then that could turn it again. So if you're Ukraine, you're in a bad way in a lot of ways. You're dealing with your two fighters, and one guy he is significantly better, even though he's kind of retarded and he keeps doing a lot of dumb stuff. He is definitely wearing you down right now. So you're kind of having to really jab and move, jab and move, jab and move, kick the leg and move, and and kind of work your way out from there while you're basically jabbing, jawing through the fence and be like, hey, hey, bro, could you come in here and give me a helping hand and stuff like that. So we'll kind of see how that plays out. But again, I'll kind of keep up with these updates, sort of as more substantial things happen. And like I said, again, if you guys would do me a solid, help me out by, sharing the video, subscribing to it, things like that, I would definitely appreciate it. But that's pretty much all that I've got for tonight. But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.